Welcome back, mudslingers. Today we're going to learn how to throw lidded forms or covered jars. I'm going to take you through 3 different lid types and show you the steps for each one. So let's take a quick look at each of these lid types. The first lid type is called the set-in type lid, and this jar is an example. So we have a lid that's essentially a shallow bowl which we'll throw upside down off the hump, which we'll demonstrate a little bit later. The lid actually sits on a little shelf inside the rim of the jar, and that's what I call lid logic. In other words, the pot receives the lid and holds it in place. This lid should be able to spin 360 degrees without binding, and there should be just a little bit of wiggle in the lid to allow for shrinkage. It's the easiest of the 3. The second type is called the cap type lid. You're familiar with this probably as the ginger jar type jar. In this case, the lid is a shallow bowl, and that little bowl sits on the shoulder of the rim of the pot. And the rim of the pot also forms this flange, which provides the lid logic that holds the lid in place. Very elegant lid. The third we call the flange type lid, and with the flange type lid, the flange itself is on the lid. The jar base is just a normal vessel without any extra flange on it. So the lid logic is that the flange drops into the jar almost like a cork and holds it in place. These 2 should also spin 360 degrees without binding. So let's start first with the set-in type lid, and I'll show you each of the steps. This jar is going to start out like any other cylinder, any other vertical form. So there's volcano step. Compress the rim. Now here's where the set-in lid form starts to be different than just a normal cylinder. I've compressed the rim after doing the volcano, and what I want to do is maintain that thickness all the way through the throwing of the piece. So each time I make a pull, I'm going to stop a little bit short of that rim to make sure that it stays thick. We're going to need that thickness when we form the flange later on. So here we go. We start raising the bubble. Lift up, lift, lift, lift. Here we go. Just a little bit short of the rim, I'm going to glide and relax. So the rim is going to stay thick. A little bit of compression each time to ensure that it's compressed well. Again, stop a little short and glide over that last part. Stop a little short, compress. Collar it in a little bit here. Okay, so we've got about a 3/8 of an inch thick rim. I'm going to start to put the flange in now before I finish the final shaping of the jar, because I want to put the flange in while the walls are strong. If I go ahead and flare out the belly of the pot and then try to put the flange in, sometimes it weakens that belly and will cause the pot to slump. So I'm going to put the flange in now and then finish it off with a little shaping. So here's how this works. Left hand, middle finger and thumb are going to support the wall, that fat rim here. The index finger is actually going to rest on the corner of the rim. That'll make sense in just a second. I'm going to take my wooden rib with the right angle corner of that rib. I'm going to hold the rib by the point. I'm going to put the rib essentially right on top of that index finger, like this. So basically I've got top pressure with the rib and gentle side pressure with my finger. So that's what that finger does. So the first thing I do is I just take the corner of the rib and draw a little line where I want to split the rim, right in the middle there. I'll dip my rib in water to give it a little lubrication, and then I'll start using the corner again to press straight on down. Now as I press, I want this index finger to be adding a little pressure against that flange that's forming, otherwise it's going to get really knife sharp. So here's the mark that's being left on my fingertip here. You can see that little line there. That's where I'm actually pressing against the flange. So again, index finger, rib, they're working together. I keep pushing down until I go deep enough. Here we go, start pushing down, gentle pressure, just take your time. The flange only needs to be about 1/4 inch wide. Any wider than that, it's going to constrict the opening to the jar. I'm going to go ahead and compress the rim again. So how deep should the flange go? General rule of thumb is when your lid sits in the jar, the lid should be just a little bit below the rim of the jar. And the reason for that is that if the lid is right near the rim, you're going to have to leave a margin of unglazed clay in order for them not to stick together. So you want to drop it down low enough so you can glaze all the way over that rim and not have to leave a section of unglazed area that looks awkward. So drop it down a little bit lower, knowing that the lid will sit better in there and also it'll look nicer. So there's the flange. I'm going to go ahead and do a little bit of shaping with my fingers on the inside. Now it's okay if I touch that rim seat a little bit in the process of doing the shaping, because I can just go back in and touch up that rim seat if I happen to warp it a little bit. So here I'll do my final shaping here. So after I've done that, I'll just go back in, very gently put the rib back on the flange just to correct it a little bit. Now the other thing you may not be able to see from this camera view is that the wall of the rim is not perfectly straight up. So if my thumbs are the flange, instead of being straight up, they're slightly tipped like this, slightly angled. And the reason for that is it creates a margin of flexibility when you drop that lid in. If you make it perfectly straight and that jar warps a tiny bit in the firing process due to pyroplasticity, when the clay actually softens because of the heat, then your jar will only fit one way or it'll lock it in. So we want to leave a little bit of a slant on the wall of that rim to allow that jar lid to kind of find its way down to the bottom onto the flange. All right, so I'm going to clean this up and then show you how to do the lid. Okay, before I take it off the wheel, I'm going to measure the inside diameter of the flange with a tool called calipers. Now, we've got two different types of calipers in the studio. One is the traditional metal caliper, so we can measure across the top. And we also have a fine tool called the Lid Master, which has a caliper on both ends. So on this end it has an inside caliper, and on the other side it has an outside caliper. So the beauty of this tool is that once I measure the inside of the jar right down at the rim seat, I'm going to put the tool right on the rim seat and measure down here. Now do not measure up at the top of the rim because that's a little bit wider, so measure right down at the rim seat. I'll take that little butterfly nut there, tighten it down a bit, check it one more time, make sure I didn't shift it, and then I have also an outside measurement. So it's really convenient when you're throwing this type of lid to have the inside and the outside measurement together. Now to throw a lid off the hump, I'm going to start with a pretty good sized chunk of clay, 2, 3, 4 pounds, and I'm only going to use a section, a little portion of the top. The advantage of throwing off the hump is that I don't have to recenter every time I'm making a piece. I can throw a whole bunch of lids off of one hump. And typically if I'm throwing covered jars, I'll throw several at a time so that I can then take the measurements and throw all of them off the hump. So here's how throwing off the hump works. Take this big chunk of clay. I'm going to do something I call the garlic press move, where I'm going to keep my palm stationary, and with my other right hand I'm going to pull the clay in towards my palm as I cone up. So it looks something like this. Squeeze, squeeze, squeeze. So see, I've coned it all the way up. Then I'll take my thumbs and my palms, press down on that top to center it. See that? And then cone up one more time. So even though the bottom section is not centered, I've got enough clay up here to throw a lid. This is about as big as a silver dollar at the top. Here's how you do it. I'll put my palms against the cone. I'll take my two thumbs, press into that little piece of clay at the top till I get a little donut shape. I'll open it out like a bowl, shallow bowl. I'll put my inside fingers inside the bowl, and on the outside with my index finger of my right hand, I'm going to push in to make a bit of a notch, and then essentially do a couple of squeezes. Here we go. Squeeze, taper, taper, taper. Squeeze, taper, taper, taper. So my left hand can set the shallowness of the bowl, and my right hand is simply squeezing this donut to bring the lid out. Below that little bowl, we will leave a piece of clay, a good sized chunk of clay that we can trim the knob out of later. So what I'm doing right now is this type of lid. So here it is trimmed, but here's what it looks like upside down. So that knob is trimmed away later once it's leather hard. So I can check my outside measurement with my calipers, and I can see, oh, it's just a tiny bit big based on my measurement. So I can take a little bit off the outside edge here. Here's how you do that. Put your hand underneath the rim of the lid. Take your needle tool like you're going to stab somebody with it, and hold it parallel with the lid. Draw a line where you want to cut, and then slowly push down until you touch your fingers, and then pull that ring off. I'll polish that edge again with the sponge and some water. And then we'll check the measurement. That's pretty close. Now I can also use the inside measurement to check, and all I have to do is look down on top to see if it's close, and that one looks great. Now these lids are so easy to throw that it makes sense to throw 2 or 3 of them at a time, and then when you fit the lid to the jar later on, you'll be able to have a few that fit better than others. So don't fuss too much over getting the measurements perfect. Throw several and then pick the best of the bunch. So to finish this off, what I'm going to do is this. I'm going to put my fingers back into that little notch I made, and I'm simply going to push down into that clay, and then I'll take my needle tool and simply slice off that big chunk of clay. So it looks like this. Big chunk of clay on top, bowl on the bottom. I can double check and see if that's going to be pretty close. It looks like it's pretty close. Now I don't want to put these back together yet because they're not leather hard, but I want to set that lid right next to the covered jar so they're drying together, so they shrink at the same rate. If they shrink at different rates, the lid's not going to fit well. This also is the reason to throw the lid at the same time you're throwing the jar, so that they're going to be shrinking at the same rate. If you throw the jar one day and then come back and throw the lid, you're going to have a lid that doesn't fit because the jar has already shrunk. One possible solution would be to take a measurement off the jar, record that on a piece of paper, and then come back and throw the lid based on that measurement. Set your calipers to that little mark and throw a lid again. Okay, so let me show you one other type of set-in lid that would fit on the same jar, and this one's thrown right side up. I'm going to cone some more clay up with a garlic press technique I showed you. Squeeze, 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 squeeze. Press. Okay, so for this type of lid, which I'm throwing right side up, I'm going to start with a little bit bigger chunk of clay at the top of this cone. Maybe something approaching the size of a plum, pretty good sized plum. And then instead of opening it up like a bowl, I'm actually going to spread my thumbs apart and press down off center. See the clay popping up between my thumbs? That's going to be the knob. I can shape that knob with my fingers. At this point, I still need to bring some clay out to form the rim of that lid. So I do the same thing. I'm going to put my finger underneath here, push in a little bit at the base, so I have a little thick ring here. And here's the one move that's different than the previous lid, and that is I'm going to keep my middle finger right next to the knob. And then these fingers, the index finger and the thumb, are going to help to squeeze that donut, that little thick ring of clay. And the reason for that is that I want to have a little channel that my fingers can drop into. This lid sits low in the jar, so you want to create a little channel that your fingers can get around the knob. I'll throw a little and you'll be able to see this. So middle finger is going to sit right in the channel here next to the knob, and these two fingers, along with the right hand, are going to help squeeze this chunk of clay. Squeeze, so I just squeeze and taper. So here you can see that now I have this little channel that my fingers can drop in and get around the knob. Now you can have some fun with the knob here. You can throw it tall and thin, you can open it up, you can create a funky spiral. So there's all sorts of aesthetic possibilities with the knob here. Okay, so I still have the same measurement, so I can come back and check and see. Now that's pretty close. I guess I got lucky. So I wouldn't fuss over this one too much more. Since it's really close, I'm going to keep it. And then I'm going to cut this off the wheel. The way I do that is I put my finger back into that little channel. I put my thumb underneath, like this. I'll take my sharpened stick and I'm going to put it right in the middle of my thumbnail, like this. So here, and then make a little groove. Watch once. So middle finger on top, thumb below. Make a notch right in the middle of your thumb. And then I'll take my wire tool and I'll slice it off. So take your wire, drop it right into the notch you just made. Bring it around till both ends are pointing towards you. and simply pull one of those ends towards you to slice it through. Take your fingers and pop it off. These require very little trimming. You just turn them upside down in the jar, use the jar as a chuck, and trim off a little extra weight off the bottom. Okay, let's move on to the cap type lid.